In the very first chapter of the very first book of the ancient Hebrew origin stories, the God of the Hebrews sets in motion a principle. He introduces this principle as the first command to all the animals and humanoids. He says, "Be fruitful and multiply." This is the same principle that Robert Sapolsky, neuroendocrinologist and multi-subject professor at Stanford University, in a series of lectures on human behavioral evolution, identifies as the driving force for the evolution of human behavior, the force that drives us to multiply our genes out there. He talks about how sociobiologists and evolutionary psychologists seek to understand current human behavior by working backwards to advantages these mental and psychological trait adaptations might have in order for an individual to get their genes out there. Sapolsky isn't the only one looking at how behavior evolved. In a February 2017 New Yorker article called "Why Facts Don't Change Our Minds," staff writer Elizabeth Colbert talks about a book called The Enigma of Reason by two cognitive scientists, Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber. In the book, Mercier and Sperber talk about reason and sociability as two traits that evolved to help humans cooperate and stick together. And this is a behavioral achievement that has allowed humans as a species to dominate the planet. Mercier and Sperber theorized that the function of reasoning is able to devise arguments that persuade. As Colbert explains in her article, reason developed not to enable us to solve abstract logical problems or even to help us draw conclusions from unfamiliar data. Rather, it developed to resolve the problems posed by living in collaborative groups. More specifically, living in small bands of hunter-gatherers, she says, our ancestors were primarily concerned with their social standing and making sure that they weren't the ones risking their lives on the hunt while others loafed around in the cave. Colbert's article introduces two other cognitive scientists, Stephen Sloman of Brown University and Philip Fernbach of the University of Colorado. Their book, The Knowledge Illusion: Why We Never Think Alone, takes a look at sociability and its role in how our mind functions. Sociability has to do with a person's willingness to work with others, but it is also connected to where a group member locates themselves on the social ladder, the pecking order. We are so collaborative that if we interact with someone who comes across as an expert through forceful argument, going back to the other book, we readily accept their argument as our own, even if we really have no depth of information on the subject to be able to support the ideas presented. In other words, it's more important from a sociability standpoint to go along, which we can see could lead to negative group behaviors or groupthink and polarization. And this brings up the idea of motivation. Stanford University professor of psychology Carol Dweck is one of the world's leading researchers in the field of motivation. In an article titled "From Needs to Goals and Representations, Foundations for a Unified Theory of Motivation, Personality, and Development," Dr. Dweck identifies three basic motivational needs: acceptance, competence, and predictability. She also identifies four compound needs. Predictability and competence together lead to the compound need of control. Predictability and acceptance together lead to the compound need of trust. Competence and acceptance lead to the compound need of self-esteem and status. And predictability, competence, and acceptance altogether lead to the compound need of self-coherence. We can see how Dweck's ideas tie or overlap with some of Adler's idea, particularly around the idea of fitting in and acceptance or contributing in a meaningful way or competence. We can see how being able to argue to persuade ties to control, and how self-esteem and status ties to sociability and pecking order. Trust is the third item mentioned by Dweck. Did that have an evolutionary purpose, an evolutionary beginning as well? Sapolsky feels it did. In his lecture series, Sapolsky ties trust back to social skills animals develop to detect when someone is cheating. Or to tie it back to the Colbert article, loafing around back in the cave while others are putting themselves in danger to get food. Per Sapolsky, game theory, or evolved thinking through of the many iterations and outcomes of cheat and cooperate behavior, created some adaptations that led to humans being able to quickly detect who was us and who was them, who was cheating and who was trustworthy. This started with kinship groups and then worked outward. You can experience an example of how this cheat-cooperate game of trust works at this website listed here. These basic adaptations developed into more sophisticated domains that contribute to group collectivism, the degree to which individuals express pride, loyalty, cohesiveness in their organizations or families, and also inter- and intragroup conflict. Idelson and Idelson did an extensive meta-analysis and identified 5 belief domains that impact intra- and intergroup cohesion and cooperation. These were instincts that drive groups to break apart or cohere. The first was superiority, that sense of I am or we are better than, and then fill in the blank. The second one is injustice, that sense of I am or we are getting ripped off, getting burned, getting abused. The third one is vulnerability, that sense of disaster is inevitable, so we need to get them before they get us. The fourth is distrust. Everyone is out to get me, or everyone is out to get us. And the fifth is helplessness, that feeling of it's no use, we can't change anything. All of these are related to that elemental trait of sociability and inferiority and where one is in the pecking order and how that translates into one expendability within the group. This is interesting because even Adler pointed to the role of that sense of inferiority and how, in a positive sense, it was supposed to push somebody to drive or achieve to fit in and contribute. Another thing to note from Colbert's article is that when you are in a group and the things you believe get supported or reinforced, you experience a rush of dopamine. And this dopamine, this rush, this pleasure, helps reinforce that idea of going along with the group, of sociability. And in a negative sense, or it can also be the thing that reinforces groupthink and polarization, and the negative reinforcement of the behaviors above. Given these principles on how human group behavior evolved and some of the behavior domains that resulted, let's use them as a lens for reviewing the 2 assigned TED Talks. The first is by Margaret Hefferman, who talks about whistleblower behavior. Whistleblowers are those group members who are able to fight against the evolutionary instinct to put risk of rejection by the group over sociability. That seems to be a person going against everything we were evolved for, and yet it's often necessary for the group's survival for someone to stop the train from crashing, as it were. The second TED Talk by Tom Wujek highlights the fact that openness and adaptability of children actually enabled them to learn and iterate better solutions to a building problem than adults. Perhaps the children hadn't been socialized yet in some of the negative behavior traps talked about by Idelson and Idelson, and this allowed them to again go against evolved tendencies. But the mention of openness and adaptability bring personalities into the mix. We've talked extensively on how personalities impact group performance and group conflict. Are personalities evolved group mechanisms themselves? Dweck talks about temperament, almost a pre-personality tendency that can be witnessed in newborns. She goes on to talk about how these temperaments are developed into full-blown personalities through life experiences, which means the culture that surrounds the individuals of the group impact the roles they will play in groups, either whistleblower or open adaptive contributor. In conclusion, when taken in the context of sociobiology and evolutionary psychology, it seems that Our earliest brains encouraged us either to pull together at all cost or to split apart into warring factions, us versus them. There was no middle ground in conflict resolution. But perhaps over time, temperament, personality, and culture emerged, allowing us as a species to adapt, to be more open, and maintain group cohesion even when it was not comfortable. Perhaps even cultural aspects emerge, and here I'm thinking of Hofstede's cultural domains, that would allow a person to maintain status and membership in a group even while standing up to the full force of millions of years of evolutionary argument, sociability, and trust impulses.